Today we're going to be discussing the rebuilding of MIG's bowsprit, and I will explain what a bowsprit is very shortly. MIG needed a new bowsprit because some bees had made a home in her bowsprit because it had rotted out. It had rotted out because it had delaminated, so we needed to build a new one. So my first thought was to get a great big piece of teak and not laminate up a new one, but to just carve out a new one out of a piece of teak, which I purchased and at expense had it sent to me, and then I discovered that I should have looked into it first. I needed to laminate one up. The solid teak would not be as strong as what I needed. I was able to use the old teak sides. I just needed to clean them up, sand them, and get them ready to use for that. So that's what I did. First thing I had to do was sand all of the great big pieces that I had cut out of Douglas fir. I was going to use teak, but teak was very, very, very expensive, and so after looking up different types of wood that I could use for this, I came to rest on clear Douglas fir, which is used for spars because it is very strong, and it also provides some flexibility, which is what you want on any spars. So a bowsprit, what it is it sticks out of the front of the boat, and generally speaking, it holds the headstay, or you can attach a big sail off the front, like a spinnaker or something like that. Now on North Seas, they tend to not use the bowsprit for that. They're just basically used for the bow pulpit, which is the rails that go around the bowsprit, and that allows you to walk forward and check things out. So I wanted to change mine so that I would actually be using it as a structural bowsprit so that I could put the headstay at the end and attach a Solent rig with two sails. I did not record me cutting out these pieces, but I basically used the original bowsprit as a template and then cut out some pieces of Douglas fir to fit, and now I had to get ready to actually laminate them together after I had sanded them. And I need a little stirring stick, which I have a lot of these. So that should do me. Got my scraper, or spreader I guess it is. And I got these West System pumps, which are the way to go, for sure. It's for the big one. And I'm going to make sure that I'm not messing things up. I'm going to read the instructions. Something I usually fail to do. Okay, before anybody gets on me about not wearing a respirator while I'm doing this, I want you to know that I have the full garage door open and this giant window right here, and so I'm not wearing a respirator. Plus, it's going to be rather quick, I think. Well, I know. You're going to hear it. Probably. All 4 of you followers are going to be mad. Hey, maybe by the time this video comes out, there will be a few more followers. That's possible. Okay, I'm acetoning these. This end piece only needs to be acetoned on this one side because the outside part is not being glued up. And you know what I did? I just acetoned this side, and then I laid it on this side that hadn't been cleaned, which maybe was not the smartest move. I mean, a lot of stuff's coming off of that. Okay, this side's clean and that side's clean, so I can do this. Probably put this down. That acetone will probably just eat that plastic away. That'll be my luck. That is the plastic that the foam from Sailrite came in. Okay, it's done. Okay, those should all be correct now. So now I begin to apply the epoxy resin to all of the pieces of Douglas fir that are going to be glued together. The way you laminate something is you apply epoxy to both sides. Sometimes they use thickened epoxy. I wasn't really sure what the best way to do this was, but I think as long as it squeezes out when you put it together with your clamps, you get a good bond with the epoxy. So I didn't want it to actually be bigger than I needed it, so I didn't apply any thickened epoxy. I just applied epoxy. You notice the pencils here. I had pre-drilled all of the holes that I needed for the bolts that would later hold on the side pieces and all of that, and I kept them open with pencils because they're cheap and I can dispose of them. Also, they helped me line the entire thing up when I clamped it together so that I knew that they were in exactly the right position for what I was going to need. And that worked out really well, although I made some errors later on, as you'll see. But the process of applying the epoxy, the only thing you have to really take into account is the temperature you're working at. And this was in the summer, but it was in the Pacific Northwest, and it wasn't very hot. And I used the slower cure epoxy. The other thing is you can use regular epoxy. You don't have to use special clear epoxy, which costs a little bit more, because obviously you're not going to see the epoxy because it's glued between all of these layers of wood. What happened on the old bowsprit was water leaked. It laid on the top of the bowsprit over years and years, and over time little cracks would appear, and then water would seep into those cracks and keep working its way in, not through the glue, not through the epoxy, but actually it would rot the wood around the epoxy. The epoxy was fine, but the wood itself would rot. So I did make a little bit of a change to my design of this bowsprit. Not that I think I know more than the designers or the original builders. I just think this is a good idea. So I put a cap piece on the top. And if you happen to know that maybe I shouldn't have done that, don't tell me now, because it's already done. The one thing that it did is it made it look very, very clean. And there's no way any water can now leak into those cracks and rot away the wood. That actually happened on my tiller as well. Rebuilt the tiller that was there, and I had it vacuum sealed with new epoxy. And I may end up having to laminate up a new tiller at some point. We'll see what happens. But this whole process was very rewarding for me. I had bought that great big piece of teak, and I had really hoped that I could just carve a piece. I was told by the builders of the North Seas on the North Sea Facebook page that I needed to laminate my bowsprit for strength, but by that point I had already ordered this great big piece of teak. I should have asked them beforehand, but by that time I had already received the great big piece of teak. So if anybody needs a great big 8-foot piece of teak, actually I think it's about 5 feet long, let me know. I won't be shipping it to you though unless you pay for it, but it really isn't any good to me now. I could cut some blocks out of it for backing plates and things like that, and if I can't find somebody that wants it, I'll just go ahead and do that. I will use it for something. It is teak after all. It'll make some pretty blocks and things like that, winch blocks and whatnot. Obviously I'm not going to take that great big piece of teak with me on the voyage, but I can take pieces of it. So here it is, all clamped up and ready to just sit for a while, actually for about 24 hours before I take the clamps off. And so I clamped it on both sides, one clamp going one way and another clamp going the other way. That was something that I actually had learned from my father. So hey, kids, listen to your dad. If you pay attention, someday you might actually use the things he teaches you. Yeah, I was really super stoked. It came out so beautiful when it was all done, and at this point I was already beginning to feel like, hey, maybe I can actually do this. Up until that point, I really wasn't sure that this was going to work out because I had never done it before. So if you don't know how to do something, give it a try. So I have decided to add one more piece on top of the same wood, the clear Douglas fir on top, because all of the areas on the boat that had laminated pieces of wood together, water got in between the cracks. I mean, over years, but still, that's where I had the problem. And then delamination occurred as the wood rotted around it. The glue held, but that's where the delamination occurred. So yesterday I added this new piece on top just as a cap piece, and I laminated it, part that I had already laminated. So I'm going to take that apart now and see how she looks. Let's take these off and see how it turned out. So this is the moment where I get to see how my rough view of my finished bowsprit itself would look. And at this point I was a little nervous because I thought, well, maybe I messed something up that I didn't know about. But I think as you'll see, it actually looks pretty great. So I had to remove all the plastic that I had put on it to keep resin from running down on the sides of it. Whoa, looking good. Somebody's probably going to tell me why I shouldn't have done that. Add that top piece, I mean. But it sure looks good to me. Oh, here comes my refrigerator guy. Pretty awesome. So the bowsprit is laminated up and ready for me to sand today. So that's today's plan, is to sand this bowsprit and to sand all these pieces as well. I'm going to move them over to the table now. Okay, so I did the origami and pieced together all of my side pieces for this, and I have some more paint scraping to do on some of them and sanding. And then of course they aren't going to be this low on there, they're going to be where the holes are, so they'll be up there, which raises the bowsprit in the middle a little bit from what it would have normally been, but I think that'll be fine. It may mean that I need some blocks for the bow pulpit, because the bow pulpit attaches here and here, and so I may need to block this up with some teak, but I have all this teak that I can make blocks out of, this great big piece that I couldn't use for the sprit, which is why I had to laminate this one together, which I'm actually happier with anyway. I think it will, for sure it will be stronger. The laminate, you know, that makes a much stronger spar. And so yeah, I think it's gonna be beautiful. So this is my project for today, trying to get all the paint off of those, get them sanded down, and then I'm gonna need some filler. There were parts that just were so bad that I had to sand out. It's good wood underneath that, so I need to make some filler with my epoxy and sawdust, and I'll fill those, and then I'm going to laminate each of these up after I get them all cleaned up and sanded. And then once those are, both sides of it are laminated, then I can apply epoxy to it and bolt them onto this one with epoxy. So I first sanded these down with 60 grit, and then went up to 80 grit, and then I did 120, and then finally I did a full sanding of 220 sandpaper. And so it kept getting smoother and smoother and more beautiful. And then right before I applied my first coat of epoxy, I went over it with 400 grit just to make it a little smoother. The epoxy, I used 5 coats of epoxy after this to get it sealed very well. So I have sanded these down now and got all the paint off. So this one's ready to be laminated. So I'm getting the holes lined up with my pencils just to make sure I got them in the right spots. That's why I do the pencil, see? I had all these pieces mixed up, and man, it was like origami or some puzzle to get them all together. That one's not right. Alright, I'm gonna have to re-drill that one. Alright, so that's right. Must be this. Okay, so I can laminate this one together now, and then I can sand it again once it's all laminated and fill the gaps with a epoxy. I'll use an epoxy and sawdust mix so that it matches, and I'll fill all the gaps. There's little pits and stuff that from it because it's old, but I think it'll work pretty good. Then I can sand it all. That'll be ready to attach there. So these ones, I've sanded them, but I never got all the glue off from before when it was laminated, so I'm going to do that next. She's all laid up now and clamped. And I needed all the clamps for this one, so this one's got to wait until that one's finished. There we go. Well, I'm ready to take the clamps off, and I noticed something today. I have these pencils, I think I showed you, that I put through the holes to make sure they're lined up, because I pre-drilled the holes for all the boards before I laminated them together, and when I laminated it all up, I put the pencil in just to get them lined up properly when I clamp it. And I did that, of course, here. But if you notice, this is the next day, and all of the pencils are still in the holes, which of course means that they are now epoxied into the holes that I so carefully drilled and lined up. I mean, it's not a big deal. I can drill them out. You know, the holes are all in the right spots, and it's just a pencil, but it is a little bit of a pain. Plus I'll have to get more pencils to stick through this one when I laminate it together today. So now I'm going to take all the clamps off, and then I will sand that one down, and there are little spots that will need to be filled with an epoxy and sawdust filler before I can do the final sanding on it. And so yeah, I'll sand off all this extra epoxy that leaked out when I put it together, and then yeah, this one will be almost ready to go. But there are little places like this this is just a divot that was worn into it from before that I'll fill with that stuff as well, and before the finished product. So the finished product will have no gaps and holes other than what's supposed to be there. Well, I meant to show me mixing that up, but I just did 1 squirt of resin, 1 squirt of hardener, and then I just added some of this sawdust to it, fine sawdust, and now I'm mixing that up into a nice little sawdust paste. It makes it very hard, thickened epoxy, and I'm going to use it to fill some of these gaps that are because the wood wasn't exactly flush in spots, and I'll fill these holes right here. They'll have to be re-drilled anyway, but and then tomorrow I'll sand that all off when I sand down that one, which I'm going to laminate today.